Forget everything you've been told about 16th century women. Forget subservience, modesty, or a place by the hearth. Grace O'Malley? She didn't just break those boundaries. She burned them to ashes and scattered them to the wind, directly into the face of the English crown. Imagine. Ireland. 1593. An era when a woman was either someone's property, a saint, or a witch, destined for the stake. And then she appears. Not a queen by birth, nor an aristocrat by right of blood, but a pirate leader, a fleet captain who dared not just to challenge, but to demand an audience with Elizabeth Thirst. Herself. She didn't humbly request, nor abjectly plead. No. She arrived in London, that imperial hornet's nest, not as a petitioner, but as an equal. Or at least, that's how she positioned herself. This isn't merely a story about a defiant Irish woman. It's a scandalous chronicle of how a woman, possessing no formal rights, no recognized titles beyond those she forged with her sword and cunning, managed to bring, metaphorically of course, but essentially, the most powerful monarch in Europe to her knees. O'Malley didn't play by gentlemen's rules. She wrote her own rules in blood and the salt of the Atlantic. She wielded her reputation, her flotilla, even her pregnancy. Yes, legend has it she gave birth during an expedition and was back in battle an hour later, as instruments of political pressure. It was unthinkable. It was outrageous. And it worked. She wasn't just a pirate queen. She was the living, breathing, scandalous embodiment of absolute wild freedom, who scoffed at all patriarchal norms and court intrigues. Yet this incredible, almost mystical power, this ability to turn the world upside down, it didn't emerge from nowhere. It was forged in the crucible of harsh realities, shaped by events that forever imprinted themselves on her soul, long before she stepped onto the deck of her first ship. We've already spoken of Grace O'Malley as a defiant icon, a woman who dared to rewrite the rules of an entire era, challenging 2 empires and 2 queens. But to truly comprehend this fury, this tempest of the seas, this indomitable force, one must delve into the abyss of her making. What darkness and what light forged her soul? To what winds does she owe her inflexibility? Imagine 16th century Ireland, not the idyllic green plain of tourist brochures, but a blood-soaked arena where every clan was a beast fighting for its territory, where the English crown pressed down with iron, and loyalty was merely a matter of price and moment. It was a world permeated by the smell of salty wind, gunpowder, and despair, where survival was not a right, but a daily, brutal ritual. Into this chaos, this elemental force, Grace O'Malley was born, daughter of Donal O'Malley himself, chief of the powerful Umhall clan, whose life was inextricably linked to the sea. They were sea raiders, but in their understanding, legitimate chiefs, levying tribute on passing ships. This was not piracy in the classic sense. It was an ancient tradition, legitimized by their ancestral right to the coastal waters. From childhood, Grace, or Grania as she was called, refused to submit to her destined fate. While other girls learned to spin and manage a household, she eagerly absorbed lessons in navigation, fencing, and strategy. She spent days on the docks, among sailors, soaking up their stories, their rough humor, their fearlessness. Legend has it that when her father refused to take her to sea because of her long hair, which could get tangled in the rigging, she unhesitatingly cut it off, revealing a defiant, boyish haircut that became her trademark. This was not just a teenager's rebellion against parental will. It was the first resounding chord in the symphony of her war against patriarchy, against the shackles that society tried to impose on her free spirit. It was the first no to a world that wanted to break her. But mere audacity was not enough. Life in Ireland at that time was a succession of continuous traumas and points of no return. The death of her father, which forced her, a very young woman, to take the helm of the clan, became her baptism by fire. She had to take responsibility for hundreds of lives, for their lands, for their future. The forced marriages, which she transformed not into a yoke, but into political alliances, were masterful moves on the chessboard of power. Each time they tried to use her, she herself became a player, and sometimes a puppeteer. She saw how fragile power was, how easily everything could be lost if one did not control one's destiny, and this conscious, existential vulnerability gave birth within her to the ruthlessness of a strategist, the ability to turn weakness into a weapon. Her thirst for recognition was not vanity in the usual sense. It was a sharp, burning need to prove that a woman could be equal to, and sometimes superior to, any man on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. She didn't ask for respect. She tore it, beat it out, enticed it, leaving a trail of shattered stereotypes and defeated enemies. Every step she took, from her first voyage at sea to her famous audience with Elizabeth, was a manifesto, a cry from the soul that demanded, "Recognize me, recognize my strength, my mind, my right." She didn't just go with the flow. She created waves upon which she then glided. It was these deep wounds, this indomitable will, and this constant fight for a place in the sun that shaped her unique approach to conducting affairs. Her life is not just a series of random raids, but a carefully planned multi-move game, where every marriage, every captured fort, every daring maneuver was part of a grand design to create her own empire, her own freedom. So you've glimpsed the murky, intrigue-filled cradle of Grace O'Malley, the very woman who refused to be merely a backdrop in a man's world. But to truly understand how the daughter of a sea raider chief transformed into a queen capable of dictating terms to Elizabeth Tudor herself, we must dissect her journey. This was no accident, no whim of fate. It was a series of exquisite, brutal, and utterly audacious games. Each one, a deadly dance on a razor's edge, where the stakes were not just land and gold, but the very right to exist. Imagine 16th century Ireland, a land torn by clan wars, where every stone was soaked in blood, and the English crown hung like a sword of Damocles over any attempt at independence. In this chaos, where women were either pawns or prizes, Grace O'Malley didn't just survive. She created her own reality. Game 1. The Widow's Gambit, or How to Seize Another's Kingdom by Marriage. The plan. After her father's death, Grace inherited the Umhall clan, but understood that for true power, she needed more than a few ships and a handful of loyal men. She needed land, fortresses, new allies. And what could be better than to ally with a powerful neighbor, the O'Flaherty clan? The choice fell on Donal and Chogaid O'Flaherty, dubbed the Cock of Battle, a typical Irish chieftain. Strong, fierce, but, as it turned out, not particularly farsighted. Grace wasn't looking for love. She was looking for opportunity. This was not a marriage, but a carefully planned asset acquisition. She entered his world not as a submissive wife, but as an undercover agent, ready to overturn the chessboard at any moment. The execution. She married Donal, moved into his Bunowan castle, and bore him 2 sons, but for not a second did she forget her true goal. While the cock was busy with his wars and feasting, Grace studied. She absorbed every aspect of his domain: defensive weak points, logistical routes, vassal loyalty, the location of secret coves. She wasn't just observing. She wove her web of influence, quietly, imperceptibly, drawing key people to her side, integrating them into her future structure. She was the ideal spy in her own home, using her position as a wife as a cover for strategic analysis. Her pregnancies and births were not obstacles. They were merely part of the disguise, proving her female role while her brain calculated the next moves. The unexpected turn. And then, as often happens in Ireland's bloody history, the cock of battle fell. Donal was killed in a skirmish with a rival clan. For most women, this would have meant the end, a return to her father's home, oblivion. But Grace was not most. When the O'Flaherty clan, according to custom, expected the widow to return to her own, she not only refused, she seized power. Imagine the shock of these brutal warriors when a woman, their widow, did not bow her head, but raised a sword. Legend has it that she defended O'Flaherty Castle, possibly Ballinahone, known as the Cock's Castle, from the English or other enemies, even with a child strapped to her back. She wasn't just defending herself. She was proving her right to the throne. The consequences. Grace did not just stay. She became the Dark Lady of Duna, Duna Hoige, effectively usurping the leadership of the O'Flaherty clan. Her fleet grew, her lands expanded, her reputation as a ruthless but brilliant strategist soared. She showed that her right to power did not depend on blood or gender, but solely on her ability to seize and hold it. This audacious move became a prelude to her subsequent, even more shocking maneuvers. She didn't just survive in a man's world, she began to reshape it. Game 2. The Iron Deal. A marriage of convenience and conquest. The plan. Years later, already a powerful pirate queen, Grace again turned her gaze to the matrimonial market. This time her target was Richard "Iron" Burke, one of the most influential magnates of Connacht, a former husband of her enemy, and owner of the impregnable Rockfleet Castle, an ideal naval fortress. This was not just a marriage of convenience, it was a strategic occupation. Grace needed this fortress, this stronghold, and Iron Burke perhaps saw in her just another profitable match that would bring him a fleet and, perhaps, an obedient wife. How wrong he was. The execution. Legend has it that the terms of this marriage were stipulated with devilish precision. The alliance was for 1 year, and at the end of this period, either party could break it by simply declaring so. Grace agreed, moved into Rockfleet, and for a year, she didn't just live there. She colonized it. Every stone, every wall, every secret room, every entrance and exit, she knew them better than Burke himself. She studied his garrison, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She was not a wife. She was a siege engineer, preparing for an inside capture. She bore him a son, Tibbet Nelong, Tibbet of the ships. But even that did not distract her from her main goal. The unexpected turn. And so, the last day of this trial marriage arrived. According to one of the most famous stories, Grace, standing on the battlements of Rockfleet, as Burke was returning from a hunt, shouted at the top of her voice, "Richard Burke, I dismiss you," or something like, "I release you from your obligations." She had no intention of leaving. She had seized the castle. Burke, stunned by such unprecedented audacity and the legal trick she had used, found himself locked out of his own home. He was humiliated and deceived by a woman he considered his property. The consequences. Grace O'Malley definitively secured Rockfleet Castle, turning it into one of her main bases. This move not only expanded her holdings and strengthened her strategic position, but also solidified her reputation as a master of intrigue and a person capable of using any rules, even patriarchal marriage laws, against those who created them. She didn't just challenge society. She showed that a woman could manipulate a system created by men to control women and use it for her own advancement. This was not just the conquest of a castle. It was the symbolic conquest of the very idea of female subjugation. Game 3. The Governor's Humiliation. The Bingham Battle. The plan. Sir Richard Bingham, the English Governor of Connacht, was her sworn enemy. He was the embodiment of English expansion, cruel and relentless. He constantly persecuted the O'Malley clan, seizing their lands, ships, even family members. Grace understood. She could not let him dictate terms. She needed not just to defend herself, but to strike such a blow that he would understand who he was dealing with. This was not just revenge, but a display of power, necessary to maintain her sovereignty in the face of increasing English pressure. The execution. When Bingham captured her brother and 2 sons, Grace did not write complaints to London or beg for mercy. She responded in the only language Bingham understood, the language of violence and economic damage. Her fleet descended upon English merchant ships and coastal outposts with a fury capable of crushing all hope of profit. She used her phenomenal knowledge of the treacherous Irish waters and the suddenness of her raids to strike where the English least expected them. One of the most audacious episodes. She captured 2 ships belonging personally to Bingham, laden with provisions, right under his nose. It was a direct insult, a public humiliation. The unexpected turn. Bingham, blinded by rage and confidence in his superiority, underestimated not only her tactical genius, but also her boundless fury. He expected conventional actions from her, negotiations, surrender. Instead, he received a full-scale economic war and a naval blockade. Her raids were so effective that they not only caused enormous material damage, but also undermined the morale of the English garrisons. She showed that even the Queen's governor was not immune to her wrath, and his orders were worthless if she chose to ignore them. The consequences. Although Bingham remained her implacable adversary, Grace proved that she was not just a raider. She was a commander capable of challenging the English administration and inflicting serious damage upon it. This campaign cemented her image as an unyielding defender of her clan's independence, willing to take any risks. And it was this reputation, this series of audacious, calculated moves, that would ultimately lead her to the most incredible step, a personal confrontation with Queen Elizabeth I herself. But before we delve into that legendary meeting, it's worth understanding who truly stood behind Grace, who was her support, and who was her constant curse, shaping her path from pirate to stateswoman. But Grace O'Malley, Grania, or whatever else she was called in an era when her name was whispered from mouth to mouth, was not a lone wolf. Her saga is not just the story of one woman who defied the world. It is a complex, multi-layered tapestry woven from dozens of threads, intrigues, betrayals, forced alliances, and backroom dealings. Her universe was populated not only by brave sailors, but by a whole constellation of characters whose fates were inextricably, and sometimes fatally, intertwined with her own. Behind every raid, every captured castle, there were invisible forces, clan interests, chieftain ambitions, and even the greed of those who preferred to remain in the shadows. Who were these unspoken beneficiaries of her piratical grandeur? First and foremost, of course, was her own O'Malley clan. For them, Grace was not just a leader, but a guarantor of survival in an era when English expansion threatened the very existence of Irish autonomy. Her raids were not merely plunder. They were a redistribution of resources, the maintenance of an economy based on maritime trade, and far more importantly, a demonstration of strength that allowed them to retain control over their lands. When Grace took from others, she was in essence protecting her own, ensuring the prosperity, or at least the survival, of her people. But were they all submissively loyal? In the male-dominated 16th century, where clan chiefs passed power through the male line, the emergence of a female captain, and then a chief, could not but provoke internal struggle. Did none of her many male relatives try to challenge her authority or dream of her downfall? History, as always, likes to smooth out the rough edges, but reality was far dirtier. Recall her marriages. The first, to Donal and Chogaid O'Flaherty, was not merely a union of two hearts, but a cold, calculated seizure of influence. She didn't just marry. She assimilated the clan, transforming it from a potential rival into an instrument of her will. And when Donal fell, Grace, instead of modestly retreating into the shadows, as custom demanded, effectively usurped leadership, turning Bunnowen Castle into one of her key strongholds. This was an act of incredible audacity, which undoubtedly caused murmurs among the O'Flahertys. But who would risk challenging the Dark Lady of Duna, who had just proven her effectiveness on the battlefield and in governance? And then there was Richard Iron Burke. Oh, that story deserves a separate series, full of passion, betrayal, and cynicism. Their year-long marriage was Grace's strategic masterpiece. She gained the impregnable Rockfleet Castle, and Burke, well, he gained a year of relative peace and, perhaps, access to her fleet. But when the term expired, and Grace, standing on the walls of Rockfleet, shouted her famous, "Richard Burke, I dismiss you," it was not just a marital dissolution. It was a blow to male pride, a public humiliation of one of Connacht's most influential men. And this, without a doubt, turned him from a situational ally into a hidden, and possibly open, adversary. Imagine the rage of a man whose name was synonymous with strength, humiliated by a woman, and in such a manner. This episode not only cemented Grace's reputation as a ruthless strategist, but also sowed the seeds of future conflicts that were bound to sprout. On the other end of the spectrum were those who saw Grace O'Malley not as a legend, but as a threat. Chief among them was Sir Richard Bingham, the English Governor of Connacht. For Bingham, Grace was not merely a pirate, but a symbol of Irish defiance, a living reproach to his inability to establish complete control over the region. He was the embodiment of the English imperial machine, attempting to grind Irish identity into dust. His motives were clear: suppress all resistance, levy taxes, unify, and essentially destroy the clan system. The capture of Grace's brother, and then her sons, was not merely an act of revenge, but part of a systematic campaign to break her will. It was a direct challenge that Grace could not leave unanswered, and it was this conflict that catalyzed her most daring raids, transforming into a personal war where the stakes were higher than mere gold or ships. And, of course, above all this loomed the shadow of Elizabeth I, it, Queen of England, the embodiment of English power, who viewed Ireland merely as an unruly but potentially valuable appendage to her crown. For Elizabeth, Grace was an annoying nuisance, a wild woman who refused to submit, a symbol of the chaos that the English crown sought to suppress. Their future meeting, which many imagine as a meeting of equals, was in reality the culmination of years of conflict, where one woman tried to defend her freedom and the other to assert her absolute power. And in this chess game, where the pieces were ships, castles, clans, and lives, Grace O'Malley always played by her own rules, even when it seemed she was losing. For even in the darkest times, when the noose tightened around her neck, Grace found a way to wriggle free, to intrigue, to bribe, and to survive. And it is these moments, when all seemed lost, that reveal the true nature of her indomitable spirit. And now, we arrive at the pivotal moment in the saga of Grace O'Malley, a moment when even the most untamed wave can be swallowed by the abyss. After decades of triumphs, audacious raids, and the humiliation of imperial ambitions, the wheel of fortune turned. Sir Richard Bingham, that English governor, so obsessed with the idea of subjugating Ireland and Grace personally, finally felt he had cornered his prey. This was not merely a defeat on the battlefield. It was a systematic, suffocating pressure that slowly but surely stripped her of everything dear. The capture of her brother, and then her sons, Tibbet Nilong, the very one born in the castle, and Murrow, was not just a blow to the clan. It was a strike at the very heart of a mother, at her lineage, at her future. Imagine the scene. Grace, the pirate queen, whom neither storms nor English galleons could break for years, now found herself trapped. Not once, but several times she fell into captivity. Each time it was a deadly game, with her head on the line. English courts, those farces of justice, were ready to deliver her one verdict: the gallows. But Grace was no ordinary woman, and certainly no ordinary prisoner. Her prison was not merely stone walls, but a field for a new battle, where her weapons were her mind, her will, and her legendary cunning. She wove intrigues with the same virtuosity with which she navigated a ship through a storm. Bribes? Yes, if they opened doors. Audacious escapes? Naturally. Sometimes it was a prisoner exchange, sometimes a cunning maneuver when all exits seemed locked. She was a master of survival, a chameleon capable of changing her appearance just to stay afloat. But even her boundless resourcefulness could not solve the main problem. The future of her clan hung by a thread. Bingham had essentially surrounded her, turning Connacht into a scorched earth zone for the O'Malleys. And then Grace made a decision that seemed to contradict her entire rebellious nature. She, who despised courts and kings, decided to go into the beast's very lair, to London, to seek an audience with her sworn adversary, Queen Elizabeth I d'Australia. This was not a plea for mercy in the traditional sense. It was a gesture of desperation, wrapped in defiant challenge, a last gamble where all chips were on the table. 1593, Greenwich. Two titans, two absolutely different, yet in their own way magnificent women, finally met face to face. This was not a meeting of subject and monarch. It was a clash of two worlds, two ideologies, two unyielding wills. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of English power, sat on her throne, surrounded by luxury and courtly flattery. Grace, the Queen of the Seas, stood before her, dressed not in silks, but in traditional Irish attire, with a face weathered by winds and salt, with a history etched into every wrinkle. They say she refused to kneel, because, in her words, she was a queen in her own right, and Elizabeth in hers. Legend has it they communicated in Latin, the language of diplomacy, but also a language that allowed them to maintain distance, to conceal true thoughts behind ornate phrases. Elizabeth, a pragmatic and calculating ruler, saw before her not just a pirate, but a powerful figure capable of destabilizing Ireland. Grace, for her part, saw in Elizabeth not an omnipotent goddess, but a woman who, like herself, fought for power, but only in a golden cage. Every phrase, every glance was part of a complex chess game. Grace didn't beg. She negotiated. She offered her allegiance to the English crown, but on her own terms. She promised to pacify the Irish clans, but demanded freedom for her sons, the return of her lands, and recognition of her status. This was not an act of humility, but a demonstration of strength, where her vulnerability was merely bait. She showed Elizabeth that even in the most desperate situation, Grace O'Malley remained queen. And what happened? Elizabeth, to the surprise of many, agreed. She agreed not because she was moved by a plea, but because she saw in Grace a valuable resource, a potential ally against more serious threats in Ireland. Or perhaps because in this wild Irish woman she saw a part of herself, an indomitable will, the courage to challenge a man's world, the ability to survive at any cost. When Grace left Greenwich, what was she thinking? Was it a victory? Perhaps she smirked to herself, realizing she had outmaneuvered not only Bingham, but the English crown itself. Perhaps her thought was simple and cynical. Power is not a throne, but the ability to make others play by your rules, even when you are on the brink of death. Or perhaps she was simply thinking of returning home, to her ships, to her sons, to the winds of Connacht, which, unlike courtiers, never lied. She got what she wanted, but at what cost? And what truly lay behind this truce? So we have dissected the life of Grace O'Malley, not just a pirate, but in essence, history's first corporate raider, a politician without portfolio, and a strategist whose cunning could put any modern CEO to shame. She didn't just survive in a world where women were relegated to the role of trophy or incubator. She rewrote the rules, building her empire on the ruins of patriarchy, using her sword, wit, marital alliances, and even her own pregnancy as weapons. Grace's main lesson? Power is not given. It is taken. She didn't ask permission. She dictated terms. And if achieving this required her to be hypocritical, ruthless, and to exploit the fears and ambitions of others, well, history shows that great deeds are accomplished precisely this way, not with benevolent smiles. Look closely at her methods. This was not merely a wild Irish woman with an axe. It was a systematic approach, acquiring assets through marriage, consolidating power by eliminating rivals, recall how swiftly she disposed of Iron Burke, and establishing a personal army that functioned as both a business enterprise and a political force. And her audience with Elizabeth? That was a masterclass in public diplomacy, where Grace, by refusing to kneel, positioned herself not as a supplicant, but as an equal queen, using her controversial image as a strategic advantage. Doesn't this remind us of modern politicians who skillfully transform their flaws into charismatic traits? Or tech magnates who build empires by teetering on the edge of legality, and sometimes beyond it, justifying their actions as innovation and freedom? What about fraudsters whose audacity and masterful command of narrative allow them to deceive entire nations, often until caught, and sometimes even afterward? Grace O'Malley was a pioneer in the art of survival and dominance. She understood that true power lay not in titles, but in controlling resources, in the ability to impose her will, and in knowing how to play by her own rules, even when those rules contradicted all established norms. She embodied adaptation, ruthlessness, and unprincipled pragmatism, traits we now see in the most successful, and often most controversial, figures of our time. From audacious Wall Street swindlers to Silicon Valley. Visionaries, whose startups collapse, but whose names linger. From politicians juggling facts and emotions, to media personalities monetizing every scandal. All of them, consciously or not, follow in Grace O'Malley's footsteps. They too understand that reputation is a tool, not shackles, and that the boundaries of what's permissible exist only until someone dares to cross them. So what does this story truly mean for us, living in the 21st century? What if the most effective form of leadership has always been, and remains, inextricably linked to a willingness to defy everything, even one's own conscience, for the sake of survival and dominance?